so much for coming. On behalf of the Social and Personality area, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Ivy Onyeador, I got it, comes to us from Yale University. She got her bachelor's degree at Yale and then her PhD at UCLA, and is now an NSF-funded postdoc back at Yale. During her career, she has collaborated with some amazing people, Jack Dovidio, Janessa Shapiro, and currently with Jen Richardson and Jack Dovidio at Yale. She's published her work in amazing outlets like Psych Science and also Perspectives on Psychological Science. And we just could not be more thrilled to have her visit us today. Please join me in welcoming Ivy.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura. I'm really excited to be here today. I really enjoyed my visit. And I'm especially looking forward to telling you guys about some work that I've been doing. So I'm happy to take interruptions and questions during the talk. I find that I prefer it, that we have a nice discussion and you don't have to hold your questions all the way to the end, but whatever is comfortable for you all is fine by me. In general, my research is motivated by a contradiction that we see over and over. On one hand, it's messing up my flow, man. Okay. On one hand, equality is a core American value. In 2018, the Pew Research Center found that 82% of Americans believe that our society should do whatever is possible to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. On the other hand, of course, the United States is also marked by a wide array of inequalities in terms of race, gender, and other social identities, in terms of health, education, income, and wealth. And these disparities are really important, and people are doing really important work to catalog these disparities. But what I'm interested in is, how do we combat inequality? And so I have 3 different lines of work that test and examine different ways that people are trying to address or respond to inequality. First, in order to combat equality, it's important that it's important that people accurately perceive inequality. And so in this line of work, we've been cataloging that people are really bad at estimating economic inequality between whites and blacks, men and women. And so we've tried to test a number of interventions to help make people more accurate about these perceptions. Second, in order to combat inequality, it's important to reduce bias. And so in the second line of work, I've been examining bi-directional relationship between implicit and explicit bias and intergroup contact. And I'll talk about one line of work, one set of findings in this line during the talk. And then finally, in order to combat equality, it's really important that people punish or confront discrimination when they're informed about it. And so in this last line of work, I've been thinking about how the ways that we conceptualize bias can affect and increase the likelihood of responding to discrimination with punishment, or on the other hand, potentially decrease the likelihood that we will respond to discrimination with punishment. And I'll talk about one line of work from each of these last 2 sets of studies. So in my work, I've explored several bias interventions, and today I'm going to talk about the efficacy of 3 different bias interventions. First, organizations and people and companies and things like that can encourage intergroup contact. And a long line of literature in the social sciences has cataloged the effect of intergroup contact on racial bias in particular and other forms of bias. And it's found that intergroup contact is particularly effective in reducing bias. And so this is one intervention. However, there's been limited data in terms of adult samples of people, and so I'm providing some of that evidence today. The second intervention that can be offered are diversity trainings, and these are proliferating. By some estimates, organizations are spending $8 billion on diversity trainings. However, the empirical assessment of diversity trainings finds mixed results, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. The final intervention that I'm going to focus on today is providing information about implicit bias. So increasingly, organizations are incorporating implicit bias into their diversity trainings and into their responses to incidents of discrimination. However, this sort of intervention has faced even less empirical scrutiny, and so I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the initial work that I've done, examining what the consequences are of framing incidents of discrimination in terms of implicit bias. So in the first part of the talk, I will share some data from the field examining these two interventions on racial bias, implicit and explicit. And then the last part of the talk, I will focus on some experiments that I've run examining this last question of how implicit bias affects responses to incidents of discrimination. Okay, so I'm sure in this room we're pretty clear on the difference between explicit and implicit bias, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, in social psychology we generally make a distinction between explicit and implicit bias, where explicit biases are consciously held negative attitudes towards groups or members of different groups, and can be changed by new information, meaning that they are a prime target for interventions to address bias. On the other hand, implicit biases are overlearned associations, and they're more difficult to change. So in lab studies, you can sort of shift or move around implicit bias, but the laboratory interventions generally don't last beyond 24 or 48 hours. And in order to change implicit biases, the interventions that have been successful require long-term, really intensive interventions. And so when we're thinking about explicit and implicit bias, it's likely that explicit biases will be easier to shift than people's implicit biases. In terms of when to intervene to address bias, as psychologists, we understand that it's important to do this as early as possible. So in childhood, as we're raising children, raising them in a non-biased manner is ideal in terms of reducing the likelihood of having low bias into adulthood. But generally, sometimes that doesn't happen and we miss this childhood window. And so another opportunity that we have to address bias is during occupational training. During occupational training, people are being exposed to the norms in a particular job, and so that's an opportunity to shape the way that people treat one another. In the academic literature, we talk about the informal curriculum, which are norms and expectations outside of the formal curriculum that guide the way that people treat one another. And so in this first line of work, we'll be thinking about aspects of the informal curriculum that might indicate norms around bias and thus affect people's implicit and explicit biases. So in this first part of the talk, we're focusing on 3 different organizational experiences that have the potential to affect bias. Like I've mentioned, interracial contact. In this study, we also had the opportunity to assess perceptions of the organization's racial climate, and then finally, diversity training. So I'll talk about a little bit more about each of these in turn. First, interracial contact. Gordon Allport put forth the most well-known formulation of the contact hypothesis, which suggests that contact with people from different groups should reduce prejudice against those groups. And he wasn't the first, and he's not the only. But in his work, he does suggest that there are several optimal conditions that would make contact most effective. Things like equal status amongst peers, working together to a common end, the support of laws and policies of the society. More recent work has made a distinction between the quality of contact and how favorable contact is, and then the quantity of contact or how much contact is available. But several meta-analyses have found that both quality and quantity of contact are related to less explicit and implicit bias over time. However, as I mentioned earlier, there have been some calls for more research on adults' attitudes, the effect of contact on adults' racial attitudes in particular. So that's the context that we're focusing on for this first talk. The next organizational experience that can potentially shape attitudes is the organizational climate. And basically, in a climate, factors in that context can signal the way that different groups are supposed to relate to one another. So contexts that are marked by high intergroup contact, for instance, signal positive relationships amongst groups, and in those contexts, people have less explicit and implicit bias. In contrast, a context that's marked by racist remarks, for instance, signals negative relationships amongst groups and is related to more increased racial bias. And finally, just more generally, research has found that factors in the organizational climate can interfere with pro-diversity outcomes. So for instance, when managers are given the task to focus on meritocracy, they are less likely to hire equally qualified women compared to men. And so that's an aspect of the climate, a value of meritocracy that can interfere with our diversity goals. And so organizational climate was another experience that we wanted to investigate in terms of its effect on implicit and explicit bias. The final experience that we're talking about in this first part of the talk is diversity training. Again, it's one of the more common interventions, perhaps because it's easy to implement. You can do it in a couple of hours. And when organizations are accused of bias or there's alleged discrimination that occurs, this is one of the key responses. In terms of empirical examination of the effect of diversity training, most of the work has found that what diversity training is really good at is changing knowledge. So it provides information to people about cultural information or diversity-related information. However, in terms of the effect on more organizational outcomes or things that are a little bit more objective, like diversity of the managerial staff in organizations, diversity training is not very effective at shifting those sorts of outcomes. And then other work has found that sometimes the diversity trainings can cause backlash or reactance, particularly those that are mandatory. There's some recent work finding that examined an online diversity training in a big organization, and they found a nuanced pattern of results. There, for people who are already high in bias. For people who are high in bias, this diversity training can improve attitudes. This was about gender, so attitudes towards women. However, for people who are high in bias, the online diversity training didn't necessarily shift behaviors. But for people who were low in bias, the diversity training doesn't lower their bias anymore, but it does increase their willingness to engage in diversity-related mentoring activities and things like that. So there's some nuanced effects when we're examining like a specific diversity training. So we were interested in whether in this large data set that I'm going to tell you about shortly, we could find some evidence that diversity training might improve racial attitudes. Okay, so for the first part of the talk, the question that we were considering is whether organizational experiences during this period of occupational socialization, so when you're first entering a new job, would affect bias over time. In this work, I was interested in examining racial bias in the US healthcare system, which is important because the US healthcare system is marked by a number of racial disparities. For instance, for the top 15 causes of death, African Americans have a higher death rate than white people in the United States. In addition, there's been investigations of explicit bias at the county and state level, and that as well is related to these racial disparities in health outcomes. And then finally, recently in science, there was work showing that even the algorithms used to determine and allocate preventative care for people are racially biased because in the algorithm they used dollars spent as an indicator of how sick a person was, and we tend to spend less money on Black people than white people in terms of health, and so Black and white people would be rated as equally sick, but the Black person would actually be sicker and be less likely to be given preventative care. So bias is sort of embedded at a number of levels within the healthcare system, but in particular, physician racial bias is also related to healthcare disparities. And so this is an important arena. The medical system has identified addressing physician bias as central and core to its work, and so there are all these interventions being implemented. And so we felt it important to understand what kind of experiences in medical school might predict explicit and implicit bias later. In one investigation, the researchers actually found that medical students exhibited more bias towards Black patients in the second year of medical school compared to in the first year of medical school, suggesting that there's something going on during medical training that's actually encouraging bias rather than reducing it, which is what we would expect. And so again, all of this suggests that medical training, this time of occupational socialization, is a key site for intervention and a place that we can investigate to see what kind of relationships or experiences might be related to reduced bias later. So to answer these questions, I turned to this data set, the Change data set. It's a longitudinal study of physicians from around the United States. They come from 49 different medical schools. And earlier findings did provide some evidence that experiences in medical school were related to explicit and implicit bias at the end of medical school. So higher quality interracial contact was related to less explicit and implicit bias at the end of medical school. And then hearing racist comments was related to more explicit and implicit bias at the end of medical school. However, the predictors and outcomes in these earlier investigations are measured at the same time point, limiting the evidence that we can, the causal evidence. And so in this study, we have a more fully longitudinal design because the predictors are measured at the medical school time point, and then the outcomes are measured 2 years later during residency. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so in this sample, again, we have 49 allopathic medical schools. So that's just a traditional medical school as opposed to osteopathic, DOs, if you're familiar with that. So 49 traditional medical schools were randomly selected from 11 strata. So the United States was divided up into 6 different geographical regions, and then public and private medical schools are selected to form our sample. However, the Pacific Northwest doesn't have a private medical school, so that's why there are 11 strata instead of 12. In this sample, we had 3,134 non-Black physicians. So there were Black physicians in the sample, but the number is about 100 and something. So it's a really small number, not enough to necessarily use them as a control group. And the outcome is explicit and implicit bias against Black people, so we excluded them from the sample for this analysis. We have 3 waves in this study. In wave 1, we measured this at the beginning of medical school, and this is where we're assessing our baseline measures, including the quality and quantity of contact that they've experienced before medical school, their implicit and explicit bias at the beginning of medical school, and so we use these measures as control variables. In wave 2, that occurred at the end of medical school, so 4 years later, and this is where we've assessed the predictor variables of contact and quality and quantity of contact during medical school, the perceptions of the climate of the medical school, hours of diversity training in medical school. And then at wave 3, we assess the outcome measures, which are explicit and implicit bias against Black people. The sample is largely white, with a solid proportion of Asian participants, about half men and women, and then 57% of the sample comes from families that make over $100,000 a year, and that this is in line with physicians as a whole. So I found that to be fascinating, actually, how wealthy physicians the families of physicians tend to be. A lot of physicians, their parents are physicians also. Okay, you don't need this information. The data set is fascinating. Okay. So for predictors, to measure quality of contact, we have 4 items. During medical school, how favorable were your interactions with these 4 different groups of people? And you'll know we don't have patients here, so that sometimes comes up. It is measured in the residency time point, but not here. So how favorable were your interactions with Black other medical students, Black faculty, so people higher in status, and then Black allied health staff, these are certified nursing assistants, and then Black clerical, administrative, and secretarial staff. And so we averaged their contact to create a composite measure. Contact was measured, quality of contact was measured on a scale from 1 to 4, very unfavorable to very favorable. To measure the quantity of contact, it's a similar set of items. During medical school, how much interaction did you have with the same 4 groups of people on a scale from 1, none, to 4, substantial contact. And again, these are averaged. To assess the environment of the medical school, we had an 8-item measure that assessed how welcoming people perceive the racial climate in particular of the medical school to be. So for example, students in this medical school were encouraged to learn from their mistakes in interacting with members of another race. And then we assessed, on the other hand, how often did you hear professors or residents make negative comments, disparaging remarks, or jokes about Black patients? So here, this is specifically about Black patients. And then finally, we assessed the number of hours of diversity training. On a scale, people could indicate that they completed up to 50 hours of diversity training over the course of their medical training. We used a measure like this, just simply hours, because the diversity training really ranges across these medical schools. Sometimes it's integrated into their classes, sometimes it stands alone, sometimes it's mandatory, sometimes it's elective, and so to get around all of that, we simply asked how many hours of diversity training. In terms of the outcomes, we measured the race implicit association test, which assesses negative associations between Blacks or whites and good or bad concepts. And then finally, to assess explicit racial bias, we had participants indicate how warmly they felt towards African Americans on a scale from 0, very cold or unfavorable, to 100, very warm or favorable. And these feeling thermometers have been used extensively to assess explicit attitudes towards various groups of people. As far as our analytic strategy, in these analyses, I conducted linear mixed effects models, and we used multiple imputation to account for missing data. So the final sample of a little over 3,000 represents 67% of the original sample. So in order to account for people who dropped out over the course of the survey, of the study, we used multiple imputation. In each model, we included sampling stratum and specified a random intercept by school to assess the effects of school and geographic area in the models. So first, we ran individual models for each of the Wave 2 medical school predictors on explicit bias and then implicit bias, just to get a sense of the individual relationships between each of these predictors and the outcomes. Then we ran a full model with all of these predictors and all of our controls in the same model to see what experiences are popping out when we account for the other experiences. This is a list of all the controls used in the different outcomes, but for each model, I will show you which controls were included. So in terms of our hypotheses, we expected that both quality and quantity of contact during medical school would predict less bias during residency, but we expected that quality might be a stronger predictor than quantity, because in the medical context, quantity of contact represents largely task-focused interactions, and positive social interactions are more effective at shaping bias than sort of task-focused contact. And so we expected a distinction between those two. In terms of the environment, we expected that a welcoming medical school racial climate should be related to less bias during residency, potentially, but that role modeling of racial bias should predict more bias during residency. And then finally, diversity training ideally would predict less bias during residency. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you the results on a big table, so get ready. And first, I'm going to show you the individual relationships between the predictors and the outcomes. So here you can see that individually, the quality and quantity of contact with Black people is positively related to explicit attitude. So again, the outcome is a feeling thermometer where more positive values indicate more warmth. So the more contact that people reported, the more positively they reported feeling towards Black people in residency. And this is contact during medical school. In contrast, witnessing racist remarks and the number of hours of diversity training had no relationship with explicit or implicit bias measured during residency. So it seems here that individually at least, things like contact and perceiving a welcoming climate are the experiences during medical school that have a long-term relationship with explicit explicit attitudes. Okay, and then in the full model where we include all of these predictors and all of the controls, only the quality of contact with Black people during medical school persists in predicting explicit attitudes during residency. The rest of these predictors fall to non-significance. In terms of implicit, In terms of implicit attitudes and implicit bias, both individually and in the full model, only quality of contact with Black people is related to reduced implicit bias measured during residency. And so these are the values for the full model because that's the most conservative model. And again, we're accounting for their baseline implicit bias, their quality of contact and quantity of contact at baseline, and various demographic factors. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Okay. So the rest of these don't, I'm not sure you'll be able to see this next graph, but people like to see all of the models side by side. You'll be able to see some bolding. But anyway, it's the same information that I just showed. Here, these are the individual models for explicit bias. This is the full model where only quality of contact is significant. And then for implicit bias, only quality of contact is significant in the individual and full model. Below the solid line are these baseline measures. So quantity and quality of contact basically continue to have a negative relationship with bias even into residency, but accounting for that, the quality and quantity of contact during medical school has a significant relationship. Okay, so this is some of the first evidence that professional experiences in one organization can shape non-Black physicians' explicit and implicit bias in another organization 2 years later, when respondents have sort of moved on and are now actually practicing physicians. Once you're in residency, you're a practicing physician. And so these findings have some initial promise for thinking about interventions to address physician bias. Organizations can think about how to foster more quality interracial contact during medical school, and that seems to have a long-term relationship with implicit and explicit bias measured later. But in order to more fully understand the factors that can shape bias, it's important to incorporate more data about the environment into these analyses. And so I'm interested in examining other contextual factors that could shape this change in implicit and explicit bias. So for instance, in this data set, we have information about the racial demographics of each of these medical schools that these individual physicians came from. We also can take an estimate, we can use as an estimate the aggregate bias amongst these respondents, and then incorporate information from Project Implicit about the state or county level racial bias and where the medical schools are located. And incorporating all of that in a single model can help us understand which of these factors predicts the change in individual physicians' implicit or explicit bias over the course of medical school. So for instance, if a less biased medical student goes into a medical school where the average racial bias is higher than her own, what happens? Does she assimilate and change her racial bias to fit the racial bias of the people around her? Is she able to hold on and fight off the forces of bias in her environment? And then I'm also interested in what's a stronger predictor, the local medical school environment that's training you, or the broader local environment where you're living and having your life. So that's one of the follow-up future directions. We also didn't find any evidence that diversity training was related to racial bias. However, our measure of it was rather blunt. And so on one hand, it might be that these diversity trainings are not necessarily designed to change racial attitudes. Maybe they're simply designed to increase information about diversity, and so they might be more successful at doing that. And also, we don't really know what is going on in these diversity trainings. And so to follow up, I've been running a study where we're testing the effects of a single diversity training on racial bias and on interracial interactions. So we're working with the Yale New Haven Health System and bringing in employees into the lab to have an interaction with a white and a Black Confederate. We have them, both the Confederate and the participant, wearing bioharnesses that measure their breathing, heart rate, movement, and then we're video recording the interactions, and we assess their implicit and explicit attitudes. And so here we can have a better test of whether this diversity training can change bias, because we have them come in before they complete the diversity training, and then half the group will complete the diversity training, and then they come back after. So if there's a change in bias after the training, this is the best test that we can do to see whether this particular diversity training can change attitudes. And they practice the strategies that they talk about during the diversity training for 8 weeks after. So we're trying to give this the best chance to see that diversity training might shape attitudes. Okay. Finally, in terms of what organizations should do or more practical implications, I think these data suggest that organizations can facilitate more positive interracial contact. It's really important to take an evidence-based approach to diversity training. So with some of my colleagues, we actually wrote a paper summarizing some of the empirical information about how to do an effective diversity training and bias reduction training. And one of the things that we talk about is that it's important to pursue a multi-pronged approach to diversity and inclusion. So a one-shot diversity training is unlikely to have very strong effects on the organization, but as part of a broader diversity strategy where we think about the problems and what the solutions are for those exact problems, a diversity training that then explains all of the new strategy might be more effective, for instance. Okay, so shared some work about how quality interracial contact during medical school can shape bias 2 years later. But there are a number, and diversity training does not, but there are a number of strategies that organizations can take in response to discrimination that's going on in their organization. And one of those is talking about implicit bias. And so in the third intervention that I'm going to talk about, I will share some experiments that I've run examining the implications of framing discrimination in terms of implicit bias on people's responses to those incidents of discrimination. So this is still work in progress. I would love your feedback about it. Okay, so over the last few years, several companies have faced allegations of discrimination and have had to wrestle with what to do in response to these allegations. One response that's very common is to announce a large-scale diversity training, which Starbucks did a year ago. You may have heard of what happened in the Starbucks in Philadelphia. 2 black men were waiting to have a meeting with a potential business partner, and they hadn't ordered anything, and so a Starbucks barista decided to call the police on them. And so another patron took a video. This video went viral. It sparked protests and outrage around the country. And so in response, Starbucks announced that they were going to shut down all 8,000 of their US stores for 4 hours to host what they initially referred to as an implicit bias training. The full training is actually available online, and it's a really interesting, vivid example of the way that companies are engaging on this issue. So I'd like to show you a clip from one of the videos from the training.
Right, I want to get to it with the hard question. How do you define bias? What is it?
So bias is our brain's automatic association and processing of negative stereotypes about certain groups of people.
So that sounds somewhat clinical. If you could break it down even further.
So when we talk about bias, we're actually talking about 2 kinds of bias. There's explicit bias, which is when we are very consciously do not particularly care for a group. The implicit bias is when our brains have made associations about a particular group, negative stereotypes about a particular group that have become embedded in our brains over time.
So how do you know it when you're doing it? How do you know it when you see it? How about going at it that way?
You often don't know it when you're doing it, because if it's an implicit bias, that means you have it in the back of your brain. You're not conscious of it, and in fact, it can be completely inconsistent with your actual beliefs. So oftentimes the risk is you in fact don't know when you're making an automatic association.
Do you think our company should be one of those institutions that helps people understand their biases? Do you think that's the job of a company like ours?
If we're going to have a business where we're interfacing with the public, I think we're responsible.
Okay, so in this clip, a lot happened, but what I would like to draw your attention to is the way that they talked about bias. So from jump, they define bias as automatic. And then they say that there's explicit and implicit, but then they go back to focusing, when they're asked, how do you know that you have it, or what can you do about it, they go back to focusing on the fact that if it's implicit, you don't even know that you have it, there's not much you can do, it can be completely inconsistent with your values. It's a pretty strong focus on this form of bias. And so basically what I was interested in is what's the implication, what's the consequence of framing discrimination in this manner? And so the research question for the second part of this talk is, how does attributing discrimination to implicit rather than explicit bias affect people's evaluations of discrimination? Does it matter that in this video from Starbucks, they've chosen these experts that really focus on implicit bias? Some people might view this integration of information about implicit bias into such a wide-scale training as a positive outcome, because it might help people identify implicit bias and then understand that discriminatory outcomes can occur in the absence of discriminatory intent. And there's some research that has suggested that that might be the case. For instance, whites who are more bias aware, so aware of the role of subtle racism and discrimination, perceive incidents of discrimination as more racist. So these people who are more aware of more subtle biases do indeed identify incidents of discrimination as more racist. So informing people about implicit bias might be useful. Similarly, as a more sort of high-profile example, a few years ago, economists found racial bias in the foul calls of NBA referees. And then there was a lot of publicity about this bias. And a few years later, they went back to look and see what's going on. Does this bias persist? And the disparity had disappeared. So this is an example where bringing attention to a disparity, and apparently it was actually attributed to implicit bias in those sort of public write-ups about it, did result in the disparity being removed. But generally, this is not actually a common outcome. Sometimes things are attributed to implicit bias and the disparities continue. Some disparities have worsened over time. And so it's not clear that attributing discrimination to implicit bias will always necessarily lead to people addressing the discrimination. And so what I'd like to argue today is that actually attributing discrimination to implicit bias might undermine punishment for discriminatory incidents. And one reason this might be is that implicit bias is often portrayed as unconscious, as you saw in this video. Now, the research literature is not actually settled on whether it's unconscious or whether people don't know that they have this bias. There's some findings actually that people can sort of predict their IAT scores actually. So again, in that context, this focus on how unconscious implicit bias is might be particularly both inaccurate but problematic as well. One reason it's problematic is because in order to be held accountable, people have to have awareness of their actions. If you are unaware of a particular action, then people will hold you less accountable, and there's empirical data that's shown that. So they talk about a person who is aware or unaware of their bias, and people hold the person who's aware of their bias more accountable for discrimination that results from it. So that's this relationship. Awareness is also a central factor that determines intentionality. So if I'm aware of completing a particular action, then it's more likely that people will perceive that I completed that action intentionally. However, if I'm unaware of completing an action, tapping my foot, twirling my hair, people will perceive that that action was unintentional. And then intentionality is a central determinant for punishment. In our legal system, we punish people less for actions that are unintentional compared to actions that are intentional. So if implicit bias suggests that bias is unconscious, and if things are unconscious or unaware of them, then linking discrimination to implicit bias might reduce how intentional people perceive the discrimination to be, and thus reduce how willing they are to support punishing discriminators. So you might be thinking, okay, this all makes sense, of course, and from a moral psychology perspective, it does. But I'd like to posit that this relationship and the situation is more complex. For instance, we don't know whether in any particular instance of discrimination, implicit bias is actually the cause. There's kind of no way at an individual one-on-one level, if I've accused someone of discrimination, to actually know that's because of implicit bias, explicit bias, structural racism, and whatever. And so If we're not actually sure that it's because of implicit bias, but we choose to attribute it to that, and then it has this sort of outcome, that's something that we need to be paying attention to. So if our goal is to
Question.
Yes.
How does impact play into the relationship between intentionality and punishment? Because like if someone's not intending to do something harmful, but they still cause harm, does that like impact whether or not they should be punished?
Right, and whether they should be punished and whether they are punished are two different things, right? So, but some of the research has found actually that even if the harm is very high, if you say that it's unintentional, people still will punish less than if you say that it's intentional. So, you know, and also it probably depends on whether you're the victim or not, right? As a victim, I don't actually, if someone doesn't hire me, I actually don't care whether it's because of implicit or explicit bias. I'm still unemployed, right? I'm still like at my mom's house. And so to me, it doesn't matter the intent, but perhaps to the perpetrator wants to say that I didn't mean to, and so I should be punished less. And observers are likely to incorporate intent information into whether they punish or not. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Any other questions at this point? I can keep rolling though, that's fine. Okay, and so if our goal is to disrupt or decrease discrimination, then this attribution to implicit bias might interfere with that goal. The last point that I want to make is that punishing discrimination is important because it can shape social norms. So it can be a strategy for reducing prejudice. Whereas if prejudice towards a group is deemed acceptable, then prejudice expression is made more likely. So if we see discrimination and nothing happens and it seems like it's fine, then it's more likely that people will engage in discrimination as a result. However, if we do punish prejudice, then it's likely that people will be less likely to exhibit prejudice in the future. And so again, that's why we want to, that's why it's important to understand how implicit bias is affecting punishment for incidents of discrimination. Okay, so in this second part of the talk, I will tell you about 3 different studies that I ran to understand this question. We have discrimination in different domains: age discrimination, gender discrimination, and racial discrimination. We do look at the impact, so how harmful the incident is, and see whether that affects, that moderates or changes the relationship between implicit and explicit bias framing and support for punishment and perceptions of intent. Then so in this first study, we have participants read about perpetrators as a group against victims as a group. So we were wondering whether this would still happen in the case of thinking about an individual incident of discrimination. And then finally, in the last study, we add the control condition in order to show that implicit bias is actually reducing perceived intent and support for punishment rather than explicit bias, making people think things are more intentional and increasing support for punishment. Okay, so in the first study, we're in the domain of age, and we're examining harm. Here, we're still in the healthcare context, and participants read about doctors' ageism against older patients. And we're interested in whether the severity of the harm to these older patients matters. On one hand, you could imagine that if the harm towards patients is quite high, say death, that whether it's because of implicit or explicit bias shouldn't matter, and we should punish these doctors who are exhibiting bias equally. However, as I was just mentioning, people do still excuse unintentional behaviors even when the harm is quite high, and so it might be the case that even when the harm is high, participants are still perceiving less intentionality and thus supporting less punishment. In this study, we had 425 participants recruited online. The design is a 2x2, so we manipulate whether the bias is implicit or explicit, and then whether the harm to the patients is high or low. So participants read this article that was based on actual research that is finding implicit biases against older patients, and the manipulation is simple. Participants read that doctors with more either implicit ageism or ageist attitudes tended to spend less time with their patients and demonstrate more dismissive body language towards older patients. And so people's lay theories about bias are that they're explicit, so ageist attitudes, we expect it to indicate explicit attitudes rather than implicit attitudes. In the low harm condition, the outcome is rather minimal. Older patients of doctors with high levels of age bias reported being less satisfied with their medical encounter than patients of doctors with little to no age bias. So not ideal. You want to be satisfied with your medical encounter, but not life or death. In the high harm condition, though, older patients got less medical attention than they needed, and the researchers found that older patients of doctors with high levels of age bias don't live as long as older patients of doctors with little to no age bias. So here, this age bias is shortening life. And the question is whether when the doctor's age bias is shortening the lives of their patients, does attributing it to implicit bias still reduce how intentional they perceive the discrimination to be and support for punishment and other evaluations. So we assess blame. So how much do we blame these doctors for exhibiting the biases? How much do we support punishing these doctors who exhibit biases? How concerned are people about the bias? And then how much do they support reform efforts like training? And so we thought that perhaps these other outcomes might be undermined, but maybe people would still support reform efforts in response to implicit bias. So I will show you the effects for blame first. On the left side will be the low harm condition. On the right side will be the high harm condition. The implicit condition will show up in blue bars, and the explicit condition will show up in black bars. And again, this is just blame. And so the low harm condition, as predicted, when this bias is referred to as implicit ageism, people blame the doctors less than when the bias is referred to as ageist attitudes. And the question is whether when this ageism shortens life, do we still see the same effects? And indeed we do. So there's no moderation by the harm condition. In both conditions, when this ageism on the part of doctors is referred to as implicit, people blame the doctors less for their biases. So we don't find moderation in terms of any of the outcomes, so I'm just going to show you the main effects. And what we see is that people blame the doctors less, they supported less punishment for the doctors, they exhibited less concern about implicit ageism than explicit ageist attitudes, and they also supported less reform. They were less likely to support training for implicit ageism compared to explicit ageism. Okay, so this is some initial evidence that implicit bias framing can reduce the blame, concern about bias, support for punishment, and support for reform efforts that are supposed to address bias. We didn't find any evidence that how harmful the outcome was actually moderated the effect, so no matter how harmful this effect was, this bias was, people still people's concern and things like that were still reduced in the implicit condition compared to the explicit condition. So to move on, we want to see whether it generalized in another context. And again, they read about doctors as a whole and patients as a whole. So we want to see whether in response to an individual incident of discrimination, we would still find these effects. So we're moving to the domain of gender discrimination, which is a persistent issue and one that has increasingly been attributed to implicit bias. Here we have 242 online participants, and we have a sample enough men and women to examine whether the effects are the same for both men and women. But the study overall is a two-cell design here. We're just focusing on the difference between implicit and explicit bias framing. And here we're in a workplace context, and so they're reading about a discrimination investigation, and it's either attributed to unconscious negative stereotypes or conscious negative stereotypes. So they were told that they're going to read about a company called Birchwood Unlimited that was undergoing an annual review by a consulting firm. They read about this woman named Naomi who was interviewed. She was a new hire in a firm that had mostly male hires. And initially they were all receiving similar forms of work, but then over time she continued to receive sort of mundane tasks, and the men start to receive more complex tasks. At her most recent performance review, her manager told her that unlike the other members of her cohort, her performance didn't meet the company's high standards, and so she was in danger of being put on probation, which could lead to termination. And then we also added explicitly stereotypical information that this manager shares with her. So the manager mentioned that female hires like Naomi typically don't do well in the company because they lack strong technical skills. And so the question is, even here, where this manager says something explicitly sexist to this woman, if it's attributed to unconscious negative stereotypes, does that still undermine the evaluations of it, or reduce the evaluations of the incident? After they read that, they learned that the review team filed a report with this conclusion. They identified as a clear case of gender discrimination, and participants read that definition of gender discrimination, and then the gender discrimination is attributed to either unconscious or conscious negative stereotypes about women. So that's the only thing that changes. Participants completed these two dependent variables, so here we were focusing more on how intentionally discriminatory do people perceive this incident to be, and then how much do they support punishing the manager. And so the question is whether, even here in this context, we see this undermining of perceived intent, reduction in perceived intent, and we do. So even though this manager says that these women typically don't do well in this company, and because they don't have good technical skills, if it's framed as due to unconscious negative stereotypes, people are perceiving less intent. And then people also support punishing this manager less when it's framed in this manner. We did check to see if gender moderated these effects, but we didn't see any moderation. So both men and women exhibit this effect. If anything, the difference is actually larger for women, but there's no significant interaction, basically. So that's in line with a lot of work on gender bias, where both men and women show the effect. So here, implicit bias framing reduces judgments of how intentional discrimination is and support for punishing that discrimination. Gender doesn't moderate the effects here. And so in the final study I want to show you, we added a control condition just to make sure that it's actually that implicit bias is reducing perceived intent and reducing support for punishment, rather than that attributing things to conscious or explicit factors is increasing perceived intent and increasing support for punishment. Here we move to a racial domain just to make sure that things are generalizing across various identity dimensions. They actually read the same exact vignette, but this time it's about Naima instead of Naomi. She's Black. The manager mentions that African American hires like Naima typically don't do well in the company. And so we chose this sort of statement because there's a paper that assessed a bunch of different forms of racism, and this was like sort of a moderately racist thing to say. And so this time, rather than attributing the bias to unconscious or conscious factors directly by this review team, we simply had participants read a definition of racial bias. We said that we were providing them more information to help them understand what they were about to read, and racial bias was defined as implicit and unconscious or explicit and conscious. And then the control condition, they don't read anything about racial bias, they simply read the vignette about Naima and her manager. We assess the same measures as in the last study, so intent and support for punishment. And so, again, similar question, even here where there's explicitly negative treatment of this woman, Black woman this time, do we see undermining of intent? First, relative to control condition, the implicit bias framing resulted in less perceived intent on the part of the perpetrator. And this is also significant relative to the explicit bias condition. And there is no significant difference between control and explicit, suggesting that people at baseline are perceiving this similarly to if you framed it as explicit, which makes sense. We tell them that it's discrimination, there's some explicit statement, there's definite mistreatment. But what is concerning is that if you frame it in terms of implicit bias, then people's perceptions of intent are reduced. In terms of punishment, the only significant difference is between the explicit and implicit bias condition. And so still, though, people support less punishment when this incident is framed in terms of unconscious negative stereotypes rather than conscious stereotypes. And finally, to assess mediation, this is just comparing the implicit and explicit conditions. But when you incorporate perceived intent into the model, the relationship between implicit and explicit bias framing and support for punishment is eliminated. So basically, the reason that implicit bias framing is resulting in reduced punishment is because it's undermining perceptions of intent. Okay. So here, again, we replicate study 2 and find additional evidence that attributing discrimination to implicit bias undermines support for punishment and perceived intent. Here, intent was undermined was reduced relative to the control condition, but punishment was not. So punishment didn't differ between the control and implicit bias condition. And we provide some evidence that intent was a mechanism that results in this relationship. So in this work, I like to think of it as integrating moral psychology and intergroup relations. In previous research, people have focused on the consequences of racial bias itself for how people respond to incidents of discrimination. And here, I'm interested in how the ways that we conceptualize bias are affecting the way that people are responding to incidents of discrimination. There are a number of practical implications. So first, here we've shown that simply providing information about implicit bias can have these detrimental consequences to how people are responding to incidents of discrimination. And this suggests to me that it might be just a matter of time before people start to use implicit bias as a mitigating factor. So yes, maybe some discrimination happened, but it was because of implicit bias, so I should be held less accountable than if it was due to explicit bias. And that suggests that this communication of our science can have these unintended consequences, and it's really important for us to understand how lay people are incorporating information about implicit bias into the ways that they respond to incidents in their everyday lives. So again, in the Starbucks context, if we go back to Starbucks, this decision to focus so much on implicit bias is a little bit concerning. 174,000 employees were given this intervention, and if it undermines or reduces how willing they are to actually address discrimination that they're seeing in the stores, that's not what Starbucks would have wanted. And in terms of what organizations can do to think about, to respond to discrimination, perhaps I'd like to question whether the attribution to implicit bias is useful or necessary. If we see a disparity or see something going on, there are likely more direct strategies that we can use to address that issue rather than this training that is a little distal anyway and might be having these unintended consequences. In terms of future directions for this line of work, one important and open question is whether implicit bias trainings that are longer and more in-depth will also exhibit these or cause these effects. It might be the case that because they frame implicit bias as unconscious and outside of conscious awareness, that they too will lead people to say that we shouldn't punish people for discrimination or be less willing to support punishment for discrimination. But on the other hand, these implicit bias trainings are a little bit more in-depth. Sometimes they do talk about explicit bias and other forms of bias. And so maybe a more elaborated discussion about implicit bias won't necessarily result in these sorts of consequences. So that's one future direction. And then another thing that I've been thinking about is how knowing that the perpetrator has undergone this training affects these responses. So if we know that this Starbucks manager went to an implicit bias training and understands implicit bias, but still exhibited discrimination, are we still going to say, okay, well, you know, it's implicit and unconscious, and so we should be less likely to punish? Or because she has this knowledge now about discrimination and implicit bias in particular, would that reduce this and eliminate this effect? So that's another future direction. Next, we did see the effect amongst men and women, but it's not clear that Black participants will necessarily reduce their support for punishment of discrimination that's attributed to implicit bias. I believe some of that work might be happening here.
Yeah, we found that they do show the same effect.
Okay, well, you know. Check. Yes, they do. Yeah, so it wasn't clear, but it's now clear to me that it would happen. And the other question that I've been thinking about is, what if the perpetrator is a racial minority? So if I'm accused of reverse racism or racism against a white person, but I attribute it to implicit bias, would I still get, would people still support punishing me less for anti-white racism, and particularly with white people? So something that I've been trying to think about. Yes?
I wonder if, I think that the telling everybody about implicit bias has been mostly about making people feel better. Exculpatory information for prospective perpetrators of racism. But I wonder if, so I think it's interesting that people are told that bias is either implicit or explicit.
Right.
And in your first set of studies, you treat those two things as two very separate outcomes.
Right.
And the question is, are they really?
Right.
And I'm curious if there'd be a way to, because I'm not sure they are, right? So like if you,
Right.
were they correlated in those first, in the first study, in the professionals? The IAT and the explicit?
So if there is a correlation, it's small, and that's consistent in the literature.
Right.
The correlation
But-
between implicit and explicit bias is not
Right, and I
necessary.
wonder if they are small because the IET is sort of unreliable, and that, I'm just curious if it's possible that they are tapping the same thing, just in different ways, and so people could come to understand that that core thing that they're both tapping is still bad.
Right.
One study that explores that a little bit with specifically physicians found that physicians with implicit bias have less satisfied patients than physicians with explicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
And that they found too, that they were distinct in that particular study. I studied communication implicit bias specifically, so I actually observed the interactions and things like that. And it's not a perfect distinction, but there is evidence that there is
That
an
they're
important
operating
distinction, that
differently.
implicit bias is so much more prevalent currently than explicit bias, so that's unfortunately still quite prevalent. So I think there is a potential distinction I could use.
Right. I think so I think it would be interesting to also potentially tell people about both and see whether simply the mention of implicit bias is going to exhibit these effects, or whether if you talk about both, then maybe that won't differ from explicit, things like that. So that's another thing that I've been thinking about. Okay. Yes.
So one of the values, as you mentioned, of framing implicit bias as the problem, is that it does sort of let people off the hook in a way, particularly with medical students. It gives them an entree to try to think about starting to remediate that, because it does take a lot of effort to
Right.
remediate implicit bias.
Absolutely.
You really have to get buy-in from the participants, and presumably that's what the Starbucks video was trying to do, is get folks to start to buy in, to think about their cognitions when they're talking to people. So how would you suggest balancing that? So letting people have that entree into thinking about their cognitions and those little moments of unconscious bias, while also emphasizing how serious it is and the demonstrated negative effects of
Right.
implicit bias.
I think you're right in that people focus on implicit bias in order to reduce defensiveness around racism and other forms of bias. And so what we're finding is that effort to reduce defensiveness may have these other, like reducing responsibility. And so something I've been thinking about is whether we need to reduce defensiveness. Like maybe people are going to be defensive and have this response, and we need to help people like kind of walk through that. I think if we address any of these sort of like the history of race and all of these things in this country, like there are going to be intense emotions brought up. And it seems like initially the impulse is often like, what can we do to like get around these emotions so that we can perceive, but maybe we actually need to like go through these intense emotions and sit with like the fact that this is going on, this happened. The other thing is, I think attributing things to explicit bias is going to cause a lot of reactance. But especially if you have hard data on a disparity, it's like, this is the disparity. We don't know why it happened. And we're not blaming anybody in particular, but we need to take responsibility and like come up with some sort of solution to address it. So those are some of the ways that I've been thinking about this. We could keep talking about implicit bias, and maybe there is, I want to think about a way to talk about implicit bias. Perhaps there's something that we need to do in order to ramp up the responsibility for our implicit biases. The fact that, the neighborhoods that we grow up, the media that we consume, all of that contributes to our implicit bias, and we choose to some extent where we're living and what kind of media we consume. And so maybe if we talk about implicit bias coming from those kinds of things, then people will still hold perpetrators of discrimination responsible, perhaps.
There's also evidence that folks are more resistant to these ideas when the training is framed as a requirement, as part of their job. They're required to go to this training, and so they're actually even more resistant to accepting the idea of implicit bias. So I'm wondering if, particularly framing things as punishment,
as part of this structure, because I'm assuming the punishment would happen within the organization, might exacerbate that effect even more. So that might be something to look at in the future as well.
Right. There was an interesting meta-analysis about diversity trainings, and they do find that people are more resistant to mandatory ones, but they have the same effect. So it's like, and if you make it voluntary, right, only the choir is coming to the training, and they're not the people who necessarily need to get the training. And so again, I just think that we do a lot to kind of like try and I don't want to use the word coddle, but that's what's coming to mind. But to like try and protect people around these issues, to try and subvert the hostility. But I am thinking that we might actually need to just be trained in terms of like helping people walk through that. Like, you know what, you might feel some sort of reactance to this information, but it's really important that we address it. There's that work by Daphne Oysterman about like things that are important versus difficult, and you might be having this response and you might be having it because it's very difficult and impossible to do, or because it's really important to address. And so maybe if we help people think that addressing discrimination is not impossible, but it's important, and so that's why it's so difficult, that might be a better way to frame these sorts of interventions. Yeah. Yes.
In the first study, the medical school one, did they take the IAT just at the end when they were in residency, or did they also take it at the end of med school?
That's a great question. They took it at each time point. So the beginning of medical school, end of medical school, and at residency, and we control for each of them in the full model. We account for baseline implicit bias in the individual ones too.
So I was wondering if they learned their score on that
Right.
IAT, did that influence their subsequent behavior?
Right. I don't think they got their score immediately. I don't think they did, but I'm not sure that those earlier time points actually happened before I was on the project. Excuse me, but I'm gonna write that down so that I can find that answer.
But continuing with the same idea, there's probably been studies of the IAT where it
People
was
learn their
determined if people learn their score, does that affect their subsequent behavior?
I know people are like really resistant. There's work showing that people are resistant to their IAT information. They're kind of scared about what it means. I'm not sure if they've done the study where they manipulate whether your score is high or low and then look at, right, so you just take it and your score is what it is, but they tell you have high bias or low bias, and then they see how that, I feel like I've read some research like that, but I'm not 100% sure about what the outcomes would be. The other thing is, if we did tell them their scores, they don't take the next assessment for several years, so I'm not sure that they remember their scores, and things like that. But it would be interesting to know whether you could manipulate even whether they find out their score or not, and whether that's an intervention. Because sometimes in classes and things, people have everyone complete the IAT sort of as an intervention, but it's not clear like what that does, actually, to me anyway. Did you have some? Okay, all right. Yes, Jake.
I think the idea we were just on a minute ago of maybe like the best way of training people who are addressing these issues is to explicitly address the topic and focusing on managing the response to it more so than trying to tiptoe around the issue. And I wonder, like, in trying to do so, you would certainly need to understand why people have that type of reaction. And I wonder if you think, like, what are the sources of that sort of reactance? Is it the need to rely on this cultural narrative that society is becoming more egalitarian, or is it about the individual sense of self and wanting to protect that, or is it something else?
I mean, I could see it being a bunch of different things. I think there's a really strong norm to be non-prejudiced, even amongst prejudiced people. So the idea that prejudice is happening is really threatening to people. I do think people also believe that we have had racial progress both in terms of racial attitudes and then outcomes for people of color. And so that this idea that the bias is kind of ongoing is, again, either it doesn't make sense to people or it's threatening again. We have some work where we try to improve these estimates of racial and economic inequality, and we thought that telling people about how discrimination persist from the past to the present would help them see that there's more discrimination in the present. It doesn't affect their estimates of the present, of economic inequality in the present, but they change their estimates of economic inequality in the past to be more equal. So it's sort of we're thinking of it as a defensive response. You're saying that discrimination has continued from the past to the present. I don't think the present is that bad, so then the past must not be as bad as I would have thought otherwise. So I think similarly here, like this reactance to this information about implicit or explicit bias is like, it's just not in line with people's perceptions of the present day and of themselves, and so they find it threatening to talk about like that, I think. Yes?
I was wondering if there's ever been anything done, or if you think it would be worth possibly looking at, if the whole like resistance to mandatory discrimination training. If someone goes through a mandatory one, if they would then, since they do learn more about it, be more open to long-term voluntary discrimination training. That could change their attitudes about discrimination training, and then they'd be more willing to join a long-term one, which actually then can have a bigger impact, not just them learning the differences, but actually change their attitudes.
Right. I'm not sure. I think they feel pretty, or people tend on average to feel pretty resistant to this mandatory training, but maybe if they saw like some benefit or something like that, you know, sort of later on. I don't think that they've done like 6 months later, how do you feel?
Would you be able to do a second one?
Exactly. Maybe later they would be like, all right, that wasn't too bad, or now I learned these helpful strategies, so I actually do find it useful. So I think it would definitely be worthwhile to examine. And you had a question earlier, right?
I do.
Yes.
Are we at the question portion? Do you have more slides?
I mean, I have like yeah, I can wrap quickly. On this, I think you did try to play me with this situation.
I can ask my question instead of that.
It's cool. I think. Oh, this is why. Okay, this is why. It's fixed now. Thank you. Sorry for blaming you for it.
Was that intentional? Or?
Right, exactly. So in terms of my 3 lines of work, I'm interested in like trying to integrate them a little bit more. So in terms of estimating economic inequality, does this one's racial bias, is that related to how much you overestimate inequality? You could imagine that people who are more biased think there's more equality because they don't want to address it. And then similarly, I'm interested in whether the local inequality where someone lives might be related to their overestimate. So you could imagine a high status person in a highly unequal place being more accurate about the level of inequality in America because they're exposed to it, or they could be less accurate because they're defensively trying to believe that there's less equality than there actually is. So it'd be interesting to incorporate sort of census level data into this sort of examination and get information about zip code. Finally, or next, thinking about whether previous contact and the amount of contact that people have had shapes whether and how they respond to incidents of discrimination. And then finally, I've been thinking about whether you think that discrimination is fixed versus malleable affects how likely you are to punish incidents of discrimination. And what we find there is that for people who believe that bias is fixed and are highly motivated to respond to bias, even when a perpetrator apologizes for discrimination, they persist in condemning that person and saying that they should be punished. Whereas everyone else once there's an apology, they're like, all right, let's move on. So I'm really interested in thinking more about the way that we talk about bias and how that affects whether people are willing to kind of punish bias. And I think you made an interesting point that I do get sometimes, is punishment the right response? Do we actually want to punish, and might that cause more reactance? But sort of, as you can probably tell, I argue that punishment at least signals that this is unacceptable. And so if we think about responses, we just want to think about what kind of responses are going to signal this is unacceptable. And it's not like there's only punishment or this is all fine. You could think about things like training or having a conversation or intergroup contact as other responses to discrimination that aren't necessarily punitive. Maybe people think contact is punitive, I don't know. But aren't necessarily punitive, but might still address the bias and inspire less reactance. So, but I meant to say that earlier in response to your point. All right, final slide. We live in a country where we claim to value equality in the context of myriad inequalities. And so if we desire to bring reality in line with our values, I think it's important that we understand the sorts of experiences that can actually change bias, like interracial contact, and also, and further, the way that we think about bias affects our responses to discrimination. And so, like for instance, providing this information about implicit bias, what are the consequences of those things? So that's the end of my talk. I'd like to thank all of you, the labs, my funding sources. You can follow me on Twitter and email me if you have any other feedback. Thank you.
Okay, so I actually just have 2 suggestions.
Okay.
Well, I guess the question first is, did Jack DeVideo design that first study?
Did he design it himself, by himself? I mean, it's a team of people who've been working on it.
Yeah, okay. So I know how he likes to measure contact, and I just want to recommend that you read Rupert Brown's annual review of psychology paper on intergroup contact. I think there's some things that Jack has missed over the years, and one of those things being equal status, and seeing somebody as an exemplar of the group. And so I think some of the quantity of contact might actually pop out if you look at more interaction or intergroup contact between equal status individuals.
Yeah.
And so if you see somebody who is beneath you, you're less likely to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Jack has probably read that paper. It's interesting. So the contact we noted, there were sort of contact with your fellow medical students, contact with faculty, contact with staff. And so we did sort of run a model with the individual, like looking at the individual items to get a sense of equal status and things like that. And actually what was a stronger predictor was contact with staff. So lower status contact was a stronger predictor had a stronger relationship to attitudes later on. It's not clear whether that is like in contrast to the idea of equal status, or there are more Black staff in medical schools than Black medical students, or something else. But it's actually in contrast to like the optimal conditions hypothesis. So I don't talk about it in the main talk because it's like confusing, but it's an interesting sort of. Yes, and then second suggestion?
The second suggestion is a paper that Susan Fisk wrote. It's racism equals racial discrimination plus power.
Okay.
I strongly recommend you read that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm just curious on your thoughts of whether attributing some type of inequality to structural racism would also kind of let people off the hook like this. I'm thinking of something like showing data about health inequalities and say this is because of either structural racism, explicit interpersonal racism, or implicit racism, and then ask about, what should we do about this?
Right. I think it should, because again, especially if the outcome's something like punishment, like who should we punish for structural discrimination? Though maybe if you have as an option like the elites or the leaders in the organization, then maybe those people would be punished. But I definitely think that it may also undermine support for punishment, and certainly perceptions of how intentional any incident of discrimination is. Some people in our lab, Julian Rucker is a graduate student in our lab, and he's been looking at attributing discrimination to interpersonal versus structural things, building on Jennifer Eberhardt's work on this. I think they find that, people who are less biased tend to attribute discrimination to more structural factors than interpersonal factors. But we haven't done the study of this woman didn't get this job because of structural racism, whose fault is it? I mean, I have to think more about the DGs, but I think it would operate in a similar manner to implicit bias, because again, it's just taking responsibility away from individual perpetrators. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. So I'm Antonella, assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Public Science. And I really enjoyed your talk. And I was sitting here thinking, if you came here, Zoo would be the perfect place to do this kind of research.
Okay.
And one of the things that which could be a good or bad thing, right? So that's really my question, to kind of think of this in the context of, because I always think of predominantly white institutions, the liberal bastions, right, where diversity is so abounds, and people are so in tune, or what I would say woke, in quotes. But like Robert D'Angelo's book talks about white fragility and all of those things. And so in an organization like, say, University of Missouri, in which racial bias and things happen from professors, staff across the university, then how, and I'm thinking how this could be a kind of a case study in and of itself, as well as other universities. Yale has had experiences in the last few years.
Same time that the stuff is happening here.
Exactly. And so what that would look like in that context, I think is like fascinating to think about outside of organizations. Because, places like Mizzou also do diversity training. And they, for instance, a few weeks ago, there was a Twitter explosion from athletics.
I was like, I'm going there soon.
So what that looks like in that context too, I think it would be like fast. It makes me excited about the potential of even doing this kind of work.
Absolutely.
In a setting of like a university setting as the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think these, it would be interesting if we found an organization where these patterns didn't take place or something for some reason, and what kinds of things would cause members of the organization to not undermine their perceptions of intent or support for punishment. Like, no matter what, we need to punish. You could think about incentive structures like, we need to address discrimination. So if people are provided some sort of incentive to address discrimination, maybe even when it's attributed to implicit bias, they're still going to support punishment. But yeah, I think, definitely have been thinking a lot about doing it in a context like this, and thinking about like the difference between a place like here, or a place like Yale, or an HBCU, or there are a number of questions related to this work. Yes. And then in the back, and then Ashley.
Oh, yeah, I have a question. So this is moving a little bit. So you mentioned at the end kind of that these implicit bias trainings are often kind of distal to what you're actually trying to change, which is people's behavior and how people interact and that kind of thing. And so thinking about that in the context of the medical school studies, since you're just measuring measures of explicit and implicit bias, given that the relationship between those measures and actual behavior is still kind of, the jury is still kind of out in terms of right, how strongly are these things related. For the medical students, if what we're interested in is, the quality of their interactions with their patients, their colleagues, etc., does it matter if people are biased as long as they do not behave in a biased way?
Like, do I personally think what it matters?
Well, yeah, I don't know if there's like an empirical answer to that. I'm just kind of curious, especially because like when we're making these like really large studies and there's a lot of money that goes into them, we want to have kind of these high impact kinds of things.
That's right.
Do we continue to look at how people score on the IAT, especially if there's a lot of concerns about the outcomes of the measure?
Right, absolutely. I do think it would be ideal to focus on like outcomes like patient, if we could get access to like doctors or residents, patient satisfaction scores, or the actual outcomes of their health outcomes of their patients. First, seeing whether their bias scores are related to those outcomes. I think there's been some investigation suggesting that that's the case. But I think that we care about whether, like again, when I said I care about whether I get a job or not, like as a patient I care about whether I live or die, whether like this treatment is effective or you're giving me the right treatment. So I do think that that is the key thing to be thinking about and focusing on. I think in social psychology we focus on bias as sort of the explanation for these downstream outcomes that this is supposed to predict, and so we can, if we change the bias, and ideally we'll change these distal outcomes. But a lot of people in organizations often are like, let's just focus on eliminating even the opportunity for bias. Things like standards for prescribing or something. Like if someone comes in with cholesterol at this level, you have to prescribe. Reducing the sort of subjectivity that people have. And in that, with that, those doctors, that study, one of the follow-ups is having them actually respond to medical vignettes and medical situations and seeing whether they exhibit bias and then whether their bias scores predict that. So it's not like real patients yet because we're doing a survey, but it would be cool to partner with a medical school, and if they would give us that data to think about what interventions actually would address those disparities. Yeah.
And I think, these kinds of bias measures are like the best proxy that we have often. but
That's right.
I think that like what Neil's Jr. talks about in terms of these structural kinds of things, is like how do we make these environments like medical school or like the medical system, how can we kind of make them less or more impervious to
Exactly, to the bias of individuals. I completely agree. Because changing particularly implicit bias is very difficult. It would require like large-scale restructuring of American society, which I'm down for, but you know, it might take some time to get going. And so, yeah, I think it would be, if implicit bias were easy to change, then it would make sense to focus on it, but it's not. And so, I agree that with focusing on, let's make sure there are like no racial disparities, for instance, or class disparities, gender disparities, and what can we do to fix those things.
All right, I'm afraid we need to wrap it up now because we have to get Ivy onto the next stop on her